Justice reporter Paula Reid is with us from Washington to talk about all this. Paula, we heard Shkreli repeatedly invoke the Fifth Amendment. Explain why he chose to do that, even though the questions were unrelated to his federal indictment.
It's funny, Vlad, to see someone who is such a fan of the First Amendment using Twitter to criticize the government and elected officials suddenly clam up and invoke his Fifth Amendment when he is asked, questions. Now here, Mr. Shkreli has a lot of problems, but what he was being asked about today in Washington was unrelated to the federal case. On Washington, he was being asked to account for and to explain this sudden price hike for the specific drug. But he is currently charged under federal law with charges related to securities fraud and wire fraud. The allegation is that he took money from a company that he worked for, took that money and tried to use it to allegedly pay off bad investments that he had made. There are also allegations that he used that company's funds to settle disputes with other investors, so sort of using that company as a piggy bank. Two totally different issues. One, the price of drugs, another potentially securities fraud. So again, he was trying to use his Fifth Amendment right, say, I'm under indictment, I've been charged, but he wasn't charged with anything related to the price of these drugs. So here he's just being defiant. And technically he could potentially be charged with contempt, but it doesn't appear that Congress is going to do that. It seems like that'll just give him more of the attention that he craves. So legally, Vlad, it's not a good strategy. It's not accurate legal advice here, but it's the way he chose to deal with this situation.
Shkreli's lawyer also touched on this event here today after the hearing. Paula, let's take a listen.
This was frustrating morning for us because I think Mr. Shkreli would like nothing more than to answer the committee's questions, and I think he would have very good answers. He has agreed, because of the pending indictment in the Eastern District of New York, to follow my advice and not answer any questions and invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege, and I think that was the appropriate advice under the circumstances. The gentleman on the committee who discussed the Fifth Amendment, with all due respect, had no idea what he was talking about, given the state of the law as I understand it to be. Mr. Shkreli is a brilliant scientist whose devotion to saving lives is extraordinary in my judgment. And at the age of 32, he has already developed several drugs and is in the process of developing several more that will save the lives of people who suffer from illnesses that most of the major pharmaceutical companies have essentially ignored.
Paula, did he add any common sense to this argument?
Not really. Both Mr. Shkreli and his attorney are on the same page here. Their whole argument is that nobody understands. We're smarter than everyone else. Mr. Shkreli, you don't have to answer any questions from Congress because these people don't actually understand. They're not even asking intelligent questions. It's the same argument that they use with the Department of Justice. They say the charges against him are because the SEC and the Department of Justice, they don't understand basic accounting. They're confused, and therefore he will be found not guilty. And these arguments may work well on a stage like in Congress, but when you go to trial, when you're actually dealing with a federal case, if the facts match up to the law and go before a grand jury, and then eventually a jury, it's a lot harder to be quite so confident and quite so defiant. If the facts bear out that he did engage in securities fraud or wires fraud, he could potentially face up to 20 years in prison.
Paula, today's hearings focused on Shkreli's infamous price hike. Our own Don Dahlers, sat down with him back in September when this all began. Let's listen to his explanation then.
Why was it necessary to raise the price of Daraprim so drastically?
Well, it depends on how you define so drastically, because the drug was unprofitable at the former price. So any company selling it would be losing money. And at this price, it's a reasonable profit, not excessive at all.
This particular drug is used by a small but vulnerable group of patients. So you see how greedy this move looks.
Yeah, I could see how it looks greedy, but I think there's a lot of altruistic properties to it.
Altruistic?
Absolutely.
In what way?
Yeah, so one example is that this is a disease where there hasn't been one pharmaceutical company focused on it for 70 years. We are now a company that is dedicated to the treatment and cure of toxoplasmosis. And with these new profits, we can spend all of that upside on these patients who sorely need a new drug, in my opinion.
So, Paula, you heard during that hearing members of Congress pointing to his numerous interviews. How will interviews like the one that Don did and others affect his case?
It doesn't help, particularly when they go to find jury members for any potential trial that they may have if they don't plead this out. A lot of people are going to be familiar with him, familiar with statements like this, but it is important to point out that what he was talking about there, the sudden hike in drug prices, that's not what his federal case is about. His federal case is about taking money from a company allegedly paying off bad investments. However, there are some people who have theorized, not the Department of Justice, but some people have theorized that potentially he may have spiked the price of that drug to, again, commit some type of fraud, to get an influx of cash, to conduct what the Department of Justice calls these quasi-Ponzi schemes. So if there is any evidence in the future that that was the case and he is charged in relation to that spike in the drug price, then all these interviews could potentially be used as evidence.
You know, Paula, just watching his expressions, and he actually tweeted about his facial expressions at the end of that, I was pretty surprised because even hearings like the Kefauver hearings in the 50s, which was about organized crime, you had big-time mobsters like Frank Costello in front of members of Congress, and they took it seriously. And here's this kid who is, as the members of Congress pointed out, the face of greed in the pharmaceutical industry, and then he goes out and puts a tweet out like this. It's pretty shocking.
It is. He just loves that First Amendment, loves being able to speak out and criticize the government, but when they criticize him or ask him questions, totally mum.
One-way road. Paula Reid, thank you.